Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another online program from the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Antigone Ladd, and I'm delighted to be your host for this program. I serve on the board here at the Adams County Historical Society, and there could not be a better time to be involved with them. We are in process of building a brand new facility that will finally allow us to house all of our millions of artifacts in one place. We will have a beautiful, large museum. We will have an education center for classes and programs, and we will have the ability for people to come and use our research facilities and not be cramped into two little small rooms. So, hallelujah for the new building, which should be completed by 2022. If any of you are interested in helping us on the capital campaign or in just being members and being more involved, please let us know. You're welcome to write. You're welcome to donate. There's a donate button on your screen that makes it very easy and secure to give us a donation. I'd like to introduce our speaker this evening, who this time is someone I know very well. It's myself. So let me give you the speaker background that I normally would be asking of our guest speakers. Outside of the Historical Society, I have a full-time job. My husband and I started a leadership training company more than 30 years ago. He had been a banker, I had been a trade association executive, and we found our passion very late in life, designing programs to teach adults about leadership, but using historic role models instead of stilted case studies or conceptual material that people would forget the minute they got home. We teach by telling stories. We find stories of leaders who have dealt with difficult people, with constant change, with little time to prepare to step into a leadership role. The role models are endless. We started with Lincoln 30 years ago, and that is still our most popular program, but we have branched into Lewis and Clark, Frederick Douglass, and most recently the World War II series with Eleanor Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Dwight Eisenhower, George Marshall, Franklin Roosevelt. And I'm personally passionate about World War II because of my own family's involvement. So tonight, we're going to give you a tour of the World War II sites that are here in Gettysburg. Not surprisingly, they're not standalone sites. They're also related to the Civil War sites. So without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to a visual stroll through Gettysburg and show you the links between the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. I hope you enjoy our program. In this program, we're going to look at World War II through the places and the people who were connected to Gettysburg at this pivotal time in our country's history. It's a complex story, and you'll learn that many of the World War II activities that were located here were based on the Civil War battlefield itself. Then we'll look at key World War II leaders and learn how they were linked to the Civil War. Many of them also linked to World War I, even before their work in the Second World War. So let's take a look at some of these connections. Here are photos showing Eisenhower's connections with the Civil War, which he came here to study as a cadet at West Point in 1915. World War I, when he was a tank commander at Camp Colt, located here in Gettysburg. And World War II, of course, when he was the Supreme Allied Commander for the Normandy invasions. And of course, his retirement home here in Gettysburg. But because of this, I say Eisenhower is one of those people who spans the wars in Gettysburg. First, with the Civil War by studying it. Second, by working here in World War I. And third, by living here. Ike came here in 1915 to study the Civil War battlefield, as do most of the military academies even today. It's a wonderful battle, and Ike would be here with his class, which was the West Point class of 1915. Here is the class when they took their class photo. Eisenhower I have circled here so you can see how he looked with hair. They paused for a photograph, and this is a fascinating class because of the time when they graduated. They would become known as the class the stars fell on because of the numbers of generals that came out of that class. But think about them. They would be graduating a few years before World War I starts, at least the American involvement, and if they stayed in the Army for the 20-some years between the two world wars, they would be in fairly senior, stable positions by the time of World War II. So we would produce from this one class, 36% of the graduates would become generals, 2 with 5 stars, 2 with 4 stars, and then look at the other numbers there. Here are the 2 5-star generals. Eisenhower, of course, you know. I love this stern photo of him, the man who beat Hitler, and General Omar Bradley. Omar Bradley commanded the First Army in the Normandy invasion. Then he went on to head the 12th Army Group in the victory over Germany. No other general in American history commanded so many troops in the field, 1.3 million, as Bradley did in 1945. After World War II, Bradley headed the Veterans Administration, then succeeded Eisenhower as Army Chief of Staff. He later became the first chairman of the new Joint Chiefs of Staff. Eisenhower, I'm sure you know, but let me just list his titles. Supreme Allied Commander in Europe during World War II, Chief of Staff of the Army, 1945 to 48. After the war, he became president of Columbia University, head of NATO, and president of the United States for 2 terms. Joseph McNarney was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army Air Forces, 42 to 44, then Supreme Allied Commander of the Mediterranean Theater of Operations. Then he commanded U.S. forces in Europe, 45 to 47, which was after the war ended, and then became military governor of occupied Germany. James Van Fleet commanded the 4th Infantry Division, then the 90th Infantry Division, and then the 3rd Corps, all of these in World War II. He went on during the Korean War to lead the U.S. 8th Army, 1951 to 53. Not bad for being classmates. Now let's look at some more links between the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. Let's look at World War I, when the U.S. Army decided it would start a tank training school on the grounds of the Gettysburg battlefield. The young Eisenhower, after his graduation from West Point, would go, of course, wherever the Army would post him. And so he moves around until World War I, when he is assigned to Gettysburg. Pictured with Ike is Ira Wellborn, who was technically in charge of Camp Colt, but who let Eisenhower, a mere captain, run everything. So how did the young military man show his leadership potential? Well, Eisenhower did multiple things. First of all, the Army, in setting up its tank training corps, realized that it had no tanks because they were just starting to be built by the Army for use, and those that came out of factories would immediately be sent to France. So for the longest time, Ike had no tanks at all until he finally got one French Renault tank. In the meantime, what does he do? Does he complain? No. He takes trucks, he mounts cannon on the back, and he rides them over the rocky fields of Pickett's Charge, which is uneven and would probably be similar to the kind of ride you would have in an old tank, as you see this one here. Very innovative. He would also, unfortunately, be the commander here when the Spanish flu pandemic raged through the camp, taking, I believe, nearly 300 lives, and spread into the town of Gettysburg. He and his wife were impressed that the civilians in Gettysburg also would help to nurse some of their soldiers and would themselves become ill. I think we lost 150 people in town. There were no hospitals nearby. The Army would have to take care, with Eisenhower in charge, of setting up temporary hospital tents wherever they could, or facilities, keeping the men isolated and just keeping it down to controlled chaos. Nearby hospitals, remember, this is 1918, 1919. They don't have automobiles. They would have to go in a carriage if they took somebody in a cart or a wagon to go to Harrisburg or Chambersburg, which was an hour away on bumpy roads. So the situation was very dire, and they had to deal with it, unfortunately, on their own. The Eisenhowers were married by that point. They had their first child, Icky, who is pictured here, and they lived in 3 different temporary apartments while they were here in Gettysburg in 1918 and 19. This is now on the grounds of Gettysburg College. It was a fraternity house, and they had an apartment there. His last home, however, would be the home that the Eisenhowers bought. He was at the time president of Columbia University, but knew that he wanted to come back. He and Mamie remembered fondly their time in Gettysburg. They looked for a home and found this farm on the battlefield, but it needed incredible amounts of work. So they did not live here for the longest time. Ike would go on from Columbia University to become head of NATO, then be called back in 1952 to run for president of the United States. The house, in the meantime, was being renovated slowly. By the time he was president, they had the home where they could retreat on weekends if they wanted to or had the time to. And then in his later years, they would retire here. More links. Peace Light Memorial, pictured here, is on the north end of the battlefield, and it offers a number of stories linking the Civil War veterans with those of the World Wars. In 1938, the country celebrated the final reunion of Civil War veterans. A huge celebration was set in Gettysburg, and the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, would be the keynote speaker. Roosevelt addressed the aging veterans of the Civil War, and he would be the president who would ultimately lead the United States during World War II. So Roosevelt is speaking to veterans of the Civil War, and he's going to then lead the country in World War II. Let's take a quick look at the overview of the numbers of this final reunion of the Civil War veterans. At the time, 1938, there were 10,687 living veterans, a little less than 11,000 people. Of those 11,000, 1,918, or almost 2,000, came to Gettysburg in 1938. That's about 17%. And you have to figure that it would be difficult for them to travel. The oldest veteran was 112. The youngest was 86. The veterans were housed in white canvas tent camps that were set in the fields north of Gettysburg College. You see them pictured here. You see the college at the top of the page. Each camp would have wooden boardwalks, electric lights, and large mess tents for food service. And what about the visitors who came? 150,000 people attended, which you get a sense of from this photograph. Another 100,000 missed the ceremony because of congested roads outside of Gettysburg. The theme for the reunion was Peace Eternal in a Nation United. The peace light itself had been constructed for this ceremony, and it was draped in an American flag, which 2 veterans would pull the cord to reveal at the end of the program. In speaking of the veterans of both sides, Roosevelt said, "All of them we honor, not asking under which flag they fought then, thankful that they stand together under one flag now." Reverently, Mr. Roosevelt spoke of Abraham Lincoln, using him as a touchstone and a mystic hero. But then he had to look into the future. Now think about this. It's 1938, and Roosevelt being involved in international politics, is aware of what's going on in Europe. He's aware of what's going on in Asia. He sees that a Second World War is coming. But the American people want nothing to do with it. World War I was gruesome. They are absolutely determined that they will not be involved in another war. So President Roosevelt in his speech says we should be guided by the fundamental faith of Lincoln, but we must respond experimentally and flexibly in dealing with our current crises. He focuses on the future, but he draws inspiration from Lincoln. He says this, but the challenge is always the same, whether each generation, facing its own circumstances, can summon the practical devotion to attain and retain that greatest good for the greatest number which this government of the people was created to ensure. He's not saying we're going to war, but he's not saying we're not going to war. He's saying draw strength from our values and look at Lincoln for inspiration. Now, this was not FDR's first visit to Gettysburg. He also came 4 years earlier in 1934. He spoke at the Memorial Day program, and he spoke at the National Cemetery. He was only at that point 1 year into his first term as president. The Great Depression was still a focus of his administration, and 100,000 people came to hear him speak and see the Memorial Day parade. Let's look at another president who came to the Civil War battlefield. This president was a World War II veteran. President John F. Kennedy had served in the Navy. He visited the battlefield here in March 1963 with his wife Jackie. An interesting anecdote of that visit was that Kennedy impressed his tour guide by being able to read the Gaelic inscription on the monument to the 28th Massachusetts Volunteer. The Park Service actually had to contact the Irish Embassy for a translation in 1935, but Kennedy was able to read it right straight off the monument. While they toured, he was particularly impressed with the Peace Light Memorial and asked how the perpetual flame worked. Why didn't it get extinguished during a rainstorm, or wouldn't high winds blow it out? Kennedy had been invited to speak at the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. That would take place in July 1963, celebrating the battle in July 1863. But because Kennedy would be in Europe, he had to turn the invitation down. When his tour guide, Colonel Jacob Sheeds, asked if President Kennedy would consider coming back on November 19th because we had the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, which is always a big event in Gettysburg, Kennedy said he would love to, but he had to be in Dallas for political reasons. And we all know what happened in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. When Kennedy was assassinated, his wife was asked what type of marker she would like for his grave, and she asked if they could use a perpetual flame like the one in Gettysburg. She remembered that Jack had been impressed by the Peace Light flame. Other presidential speakers who have been at the Battle of Gettysburg anniversaries: the 50th anniversary was President Woodrow Wilson, the 75th anniversary was President Franklin Roosevelt, and the 100th anniversary, since Kennedy could not attend, was past President Dwight Eisenhower. Visitors to Gettysburg National Military Park often drive right by Macmillan Woods during their battlefield tours. They pass by this sign on West Confederate Avenue, assuming it's only a youth campground and a horse trailer parking lot. They think there's nothing of historic value to see. But that assumption would be wrong. In fact, this area was once the site for 3 major programs with colorful stories from the 20th century. This area once housed an African-American CCC camp whose Depression-era workers cleared the battlefield to make it into the beautiful site you see today. Then during World War II, it would become the secret training area for an Army psychological warfare operation. Still later in the war, it served as a POW camp for German prisoners. So let's look at this site and its stories. There were actually 2 CCC camps on the Gettysburg battlefield, but this time I want to focus on Camp NP2, which is the one in Macmillan Woods. It's the one whose story leads directly to World War II. This photo shows the size of the camp. To orient yourself, look in the woods at the top left of the photo where you come out on West Confederate Avenue. So it's quite a large camp. This is a photo of the men first arriving in Gettysburg. They were wearing their brand new uniforms. I point that out because throughout the country, many of the enrollees in the CCC programs were reporting to their assignments hungry, underweight, and wearing torn clothing. Once they were part of the program, they would be issued uniforms. They would get 3 square meals a day, and they'd have their housing provided at no charge. The CCC camps were segregated, and nearly all of them had white officers. But Camp NP2 is noteworthy for having the first all-black officer command structure. Here you see the park superintendent with those officers. The start of the CCC work in Gettysburg coincided with a change in management of the battlefield park. Prior to 1933, the battlefield was maintained by the War Department, but in 1933 it was turned over to the National Park Service. The first superintendent was James McConaughey, a veteran of World War I, who set out to clean and upgrade the battlefield and the cemetery with some major projects. The men would plant and prune trees, they would cut and haul wood, they fought forest fires, they installed and repaired roads and bridges, they repaired fences, they cleaned the monuments on the battlefield, and they reset the grave markers in the National Cemetery. For the 75th reunion of the Civil War veterans, the CCC workers helped to construct the Peace Light Memorial and its gas line. They built the structures for the ceremonies, and they constructed that big camp that you saw for the veterans. Peace Light ceremonies and cleaning the battlefield for thousands of visitors was a credit to the men of the CCC camps, and it was President Roosevelt who had made their work possible by creating the CCC. Now here's a map showing where the CCC camps were located between 1934 and 42. In 42, of course, the United States would be at war, so the men, most of them, would go off to the military, and the camps would be abandoned. Now here is the CCC Camp NP2 after the men completed their service, and the camp had a new function in World War II. Camp was renamed in honor of a Civil War general, George Sharp, who served here in Gettysburg and who was probably the first full-time intelligence commander in that war. You see General Sharp and John Babcock in this picture from Gettysburg, where they did a remarkable job in collecting, analyzing, and sharing intelligence for the entire Army of the Potomac. Why is this unique? Because up to that point, most intelligence gathering was done by individual commanders and their staff, and it was not centralized, and it wasn't shared. So Sharp and Babcock would make a major shift, and it would prove invaluable to the Army's decisions. So the Army creates a psychological warfare training facility here, whose work would be to provide mobile radio broadcasting services to go to Europe in World War II. They would drop leaflets to the German people. They would broadcast radio stations in German to the people and to the armies, and they would try to convince people that the war was nearing an end, they were losing, and that they should surrender to the Americans. The people they hired in the camp were not traditional soldiers. They were linguists. Many of them were escaped from Germany itself or other parts of Europe that the Nazis had taken over. They were people who were artists. They had writers. They had truck drivers, and they had radio broadcasting experts. It was a most colorful group, very non-traditional military group. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of what went on here at Camp Sharp. We had a program earlier in the year in which Greg Howe spoke about it and its connection with Camp Ritchie. And then there is this marvelous book by Dr. Beverly Eddy, The Story of Camp Sharp. She calls it Camp Sharp's Psycho Boys. Dr. Eddy is a wonderful writer, and she was a professor of German and other languages at Dickinson College, and she was able to interview many of the soldiers from Camp Sharp, some of whom still live in Germany. After their war service in radio broadcasting and leaflet dropping in Europe, many of them stayed on after the war and had jobs as translators. Here is Dr. Beverly Eddy herself. She is showing a tour group that we had taken to the battlefield. She is showing them what the map looked like, and she's holding it in the same position as the layout. See the line of trees? That's where the buildings were, and at the far end you see the flagpole being the only surviving structure from Camp Sharp. We're hoping that the Park Service will put up a marker to honor the work of Camp Sharp, as well as the site of the CCC camp that was here. But that's another project for another day, but I think it deserves some recognition since the spot still looks very much as it did back in World War II. Now, how do you find it? Come down West Confederate Avenue. The sign says Macmillan Woods, and it also says horse trailer parking. Now let's take it from the CCC camp and the Army camp to its next existence as a POW camp. Do you remember the map I showed you of the CCC camps? Well, most of them would be deserted when World War II began, but they would then have buildings, they would have running water. They were perfect for POW camps during the war. So many of them would be converted to POW camps. So if you match this map to the one of the CCC camps, you will see a great deal of overlap. There were several locations on the battlefield that were used to house the German prisoners of war who were brought here in 1944 and 45. The first camp was located along the west side of Emmitsburg Road, just south of Long Lane. It was built by 50 prisoners who were brought here from Camp Meade in Maryland in June of 1944. Until they got the camp built, they would stay at the National Guard Armory where they had inside facilities and running water. When they finished construction of the camp, the men would stay in tents. It was, however, designed to be a temporary camp, not to go through the winter because it was only in tents. But it would hold, the first camp held 500 POWs and 90 guards. Why do we have a camp here in Gettysburg in the first place? The reason was to help out in the farms, in the fruit orchards, and in the canning factories to replace all the people who had gone to work in the military service. The German POWs were paid hourly wages, though most of it was taken by the federal government. They earned 10 cents an hour, and it would be credited to an account, and they received coupons instead of cash. And then they could spend their coupons on cigarettes, soap, milk, whatever else they found at the PX. So after the 1944 apple harvest, most of the prisoners were moved to other camps. They left, however, 200 men here in Gettysburg in the fall, and then by winter, when Camp Sharp was evacuated and the men had gone to Europe and the camp was cleaned up, then they were able to move the German POW camp into Camp Sharp. Here they would have hard-built buildings, cabins. They would have housing. They would have a place to eat. They would have showers, anything they needed. During the winter, those who stayed here spent their time cutting wood. Then in the spring of 1945, 350 more prisoners arrived in Gettysburg, and they were put to work in the canning factories. Only 2 of the men escaped, and they were ultimately caught and returned. Seems that they didn't want to run away from work. Their plan was to be absorbed into the general population here and not have to go back to Germany when the war was over. But when the war ended, all the German POWs were shipped back to Germany, even those who wanted to stay in the U.S. I think you will enjoy this letter from a family in nearby Westminster, Maryland. This is a letter that my mother wrote to her brother who was serving in India with the Army Air Corps. She says, here at 2 canning factories in Westminster, they just brought 300 German prisoners to work during the green pea rush season, and they say that the men are crazy about it over here. They are even willing to work without pay. She said she thinks they get 80 cents a day, but they also get their meals and board. But the men were amazed when they entered the country to find that New York had not been bombed as they were told, and they were so happy, some of them cried, to think how they had been tricked, and to find things so nice here. Imagine that. That letter is dated July 14th, 1944, from my mother, Tula Lefteris. Now here's a story of a very special gentleman. This is Dr. Chester Crist, who was the physician to the POW camp here in Gettysburg. You see him pictured here in the suit with 3 of the German prisoners. His own father was a Civil War veteran, wounded at Bull Run, and Dr. Crist was a man of many hats. He was the county coroner, the chief of the tuberculosis clinic, the medical director of Gettysburg College. He was the physicians for the Adams County Jail and the almshouse. He served on the school board. He was acting sheriff. He belonged to at least 8 service clubs and even played baseball on the old-timers team. What an amazing gentleman, and a wonderful, well-respected, and kind doctor. Tom Crist, who is his grandson, remembers visiting the POW camp with his grandfather, and he found the soldiers were very kind to him. They made him little carved toys and things out of wood. But if you look at this picture, you'll see the German soldiers. Think about them. Look at their ages. They probably had children back home. And seeing a little child, how would you react? You know, you would suddenly have a yearning to be around your own family. So, very interesting to see the human side of the war. Now, there's another POW camp of a different sort. This is located at Pine Grove Furnace, which is west of Gettysburg on the Chambersburg Road, and it's up in the mountains. Pine Grove Furnace was an interrogation camp. When prisoners were first brought over to the United States, they had to be interrogated to see if they knew any military plans. And they would come to a camp like this one, which today is called Camp Michaud. Its name has changed. But they would come to Pine Grove Furnace, where they would be put into units. They were separated, the Navy from the Army, the officers from the enlisted men. And then people who spoke fluent German would be put in their bunk rooms with them and would listen in on the conversations, as well as having the formal interrogations to see if they could learn any secrets that the men had brought with them. Once they left the interrogation camp, they were assigned to work camps, and the one in Gettysburg was a work camp. The men there did work in the fruit orchards. They worked on the farms. Camp Michaud today is a fascinating place. The outline of the camp is still there. The buildings are gone, but there is still a park there, so you can walk through it and see the areas. Many of the prisoners carved their names on the stones, and so those are still showing. It's a fascinating place to visit. A German prisoner, Harry Backhaus, did this painting of the camp. Backhaus would return to Germany after the war and become a famous painter. This particular painting exists at the Adams County Historical Society. It's huge. You would enjoy seeing it, I'm sure. Now, with gas rationing for civilians during the war, you can just imagine what happened to the tourist trade in Gettysburg. Hotels, motels were suddenly empty, and one of those facilities found a good use by the U.S. Navy. Here, in a motel, 2 miles south of town on the Emmitsburg Road, an amazing story took place. The Navy's map-making program was located here. They had 45 cartographers from the U.S. Forest Service working on tight deadlines for the military. Here's a colored postcard showing what the Lee Mead Inn looked like with its main building on Steinway Avenue and the cottages surrounding it. To give you a sense of how far south it was on the battlefield, because the buildings are no longer there, you can use the Longstreet Tower as a landmark, because from that tower you could look right out onto the other road, Steinway Avenue, and see the motel pictured here. So let me tell you the story from this 2-page story in the Gettysburg Times on November 3, 1945. I know you can't read it, so I've got some excerpts here. Quote, with the lifting recently of the solid wall of secrecy that has surrounded the Navy war mapping program at the Lee Mead Inn, an amazing story was revealed about the part of Jack King and his staff of 45 players in winning the war in the Pacific. Strict secrecy was observed in the work. The aerial photographs which came here from the Pacific were identified only by a project number. What the men did know of their work, they could discuss with no one outside the staff, not even their families. Civilian guards employed by the National Park Service guarded the inn 24 hours a day, and all critical maps and manuscripts not in use were kept in specially constructed vaults in the inn's basement. The way in which Gettysburg staff turned out accurate work under the pressure of Navy deadlines has won a well done from Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. In this picture, you can see Jack King, who was the engineer in charge of the Forest Service cartographers who drew the maps. Now let's look at what happened in Gettysburg College. We had an Army Air Corps training program for 2 years. Almost 1,700 cadets took officer training in flight skills, medical work, military drill, and they had their academic courses. They lived in the dorms, and I'm sure the women students were delighted to have some men finally coming back to college as opposed to everybody leaving college. The program ran for 5 months with academic work as well as 10 hours of flight training. So all different parts of Gettysburg were involved in the war effort. We don't talk enough about the home front, but the people of Adams County were very involved in the war work, and they were affected by the shortages. We talked earlier about gas shortages, and I recall stories from my own parents who were in the restaurant business at the time. They had to work harder just to get the food that they needed, and they often negotiated with farmers to decide who would have enough gas that week to drive out to the farm to pick up eggs, to pick up meat and other goods that they needed. Here you see some of the food stamps. Rationing was hard. My husband recalls as a young child that they had margarine, which was white, and they got a package of yellow dye to put in it, to churn it in there to make it look like real butter. Here you see the Boy Scouts collecting scrap metal for the military. And speaking of metal, let's look at what happened to the battlefield park during World War II. In September 1942, the Gettysburg National Military Park contributed 18 tons of metal to a national scrap metal drive. They pulled up iron fencing, iron posts, cautionary signs, equipment, 82 directional signs, and they donated trucks. In October, a month later, they added 38 more tons. And that's what this picture shows. The ornamental cannonballs that had been placed on pedestals to mark the park roads. Do you see them on the top? Okay, they had cannonballs on posts, and they could string chains marking the roads so you would know where the walkways were and where not to walk. These were not actual cannonballs from the Civil War. These were ornamental cannonballs. Those went. Then later the park gave up weapons from the battlefield. They donated guns, howitzers, and siege guns, but none of the cannon that were made before the Civil War. Only post-war guns that had been placed there. Okay, so that's 1942, October. Then they get a letter from the War Department asking the Park Service to evaluate what was left. Okay, they gave 18 tons in September, 38 tons more in October. Now they're being asked to prioritize the statuary and the signs that are in the battlefield park itself if they were needed desperately to make planes, ships, tanks, whatever. So the poor park superintendent would have to make a list, and here are his priorities. He said if he had to give them up, first he would give 19 bronze itinerary tablets, which would be the signs showing you stop here, stop number 3, stop number 4. Then he said he could give up 197 Civil War cannons and those artillery tubes that mark the headquarters for the generals of the two armies. He could give up, as a next priority, 256 interpretive tablets explaining what went on in the battle. Then, if he had to, the next layer would be objects on the monuments, muskets, drums, canteens, metal flags. Then he picked out 19 statues that could go next if they were needed. Then inscriptive tablets on the regimental or the state monuments. Then it got really awful. Then he said if he had to, the next priority would be 43 statues, equestrian statues, and standing statues, and the bust of Lincoln in the National Cemetery. And the very last 3 to go would be the 3 monuments that he valued for their, quote, highly artistic merit, the Virginia, North Carolina, and Alabama state monuments. Fortunately, someone spoke up on his behalf and convinced the War Department that we would do a dishonor to the men of the Civil War to give up their statues for another war. So the statuary remained. They just ended up giving their signs, their trucks, etc. So that was the home front. Let's go back and look at some more links. Let's look at some people now, people who have visited the Gettysburg battlefield, who are related to World War II. Of course, our biggest fan was President Eisenhower, who preferred to be called General Eisenhower. When he retired here to his first and only permanent home, because he and Mamie had spent their lifetime living in government housing, the Eisenhowers bought a home here in Gettysburg, settled in, and he gloried in having friends come and give them tours. This is actually a magazine article that gives the Eisenhower tour of the stops that he would include and places that he thought were significant, and his feelings about what happened at each of those spots. Fascinating article. But let's look at one of his visitors. Here's Eisenhower giving one of his famous tours to British General Montgomery. Monty was a part of Ike's D-Day team. Monty loved the spotlight, and he was an opinionated man all his life. He had been a real pain during the D-Day planning, and now here he was in Gettysburg telling Ike and the press, of course, who were following them around, how this battle should have been run. Here's another photo. The visit was in June of 1957, and Monty and Ike stopped at the Virginia Monument, and Monty gave his view of the battle to the press. He was just a little critical and highly egotistical. He said very loud, pointing to Pickett's charge, he thought that Lee and Meade should both have been sacked. And he turned to Eisenhower for confirmation. Don't you agree, Ike? Eisenhower, and I love this photo of him leaning there looking just a little disgusted by this whole thing. He said, listen, Monty, I live here. I have nothing to say about the matter. Good comment. But I think that Ike got his due when he showed Monty the inside of the cannon. Another World War II leader shown here was Charles de Gaulle from France, who at the time that he visited in 1960 was the president of France. Ike gave him a personal tour of the battlefield. De Gaulle, like Eisenhower, had been an early proponent of the tank in World War I and would in fact command tanks in World War II. And because of their mutual military background, Ike talked about the weaponry of the Civil War. Shortly after this visit, both de Gaulle and Eisenhower, as heads of their respective countries, would go to a summit conference that had been planned in Paris between the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. But something had happened in between this visit and the summit. It was called the U-2 incident. Now, for those of you who don't remember the Cold War, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down while photographing deep within the Soviet Union. The pilot was saved, and the Soviets were furious. The United States was spying on them. Eisenhower shows up in Paris for the summit conference, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev brings the conference to a halt, accusing Eisenhower of knowing everything that was going on with the spying incident, telling him he had to halt it immediately, telling him to stop all flights over Soviet territory, apologize for any flights previously made, and punish the persons responsible. Then Khrushchev storms out of the talks. President Charles de Gaulle turns to Eisenhower and said, I will support you no matter what happens with Khrushchev. So the friendship between these two World War II commanders, both of them now heads of their respective countries, was still a very strong and supportive one. And here's another gentleman you may recognize, the English bulldog, Mr. Winston Churchill, was here in Gettysburg several times. And let's look at his trips. Churchill was a huge fan of the American Civil War. He made several trips to Gettysburg, in fact. He had written about the Civil War in his book, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, and came here first with his brother Jack in October 1929. They visited American Civil War battlefields, going first to Gettysburg, then Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Spotsylvania. Churchill would then write magazine articles about his tour. And here's what he said in one of those articles. No one can understand what happened merely through reading and studying maps. You must see the ground and cover the distances. And I love this picture of Winston with his Western hat on, his cowboy hat. Then in May 1943, during World War II, Churchill would visit with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, where they would go to Camp David. The two men were there to plan war policy. But on their drive up to Camp David, as they passed Frederick, Maryland, Winston Churchill starts quoting the Civil War poem of Barbara Fritchie. And he starts talking to Roosevelt about the United States Civil War with such enthusiasm that he entertained them all the way through the trip. Roosevelt was seriously impressed with Churchill's knowledge of our history. Then in May of 1959, many years later, Churchill had suffered a stroke. He was now retired as prime minister, and he came to visit Eisenhower at his farm. Ike knew of his love of the Civil War, so he made sure to take him around, first on the golf cart. They drove around and he showed him the farm, and because he backed right into the battlefield, they went as far as they could go. Churchill at this time was 84 years old and had had a stroke and could not walk Pickett's charge. So Ike rented the helicopter to fly over the ground of Pickett's charge with Churchill. Eisenhower was only 68. He was now in his second term as president, and he would then be succeeded by Kennedy in 1960. So you have a sense of where we are in the time frame. Now let's look at one final link between the Civil War, World Wars I and II, by going to the Soldiers' National Cemetery. This is the cemetery that Lincoln dedicated. It is now home to a huge number of World War I and World War II veterans, and has been enlarged, as you can see, many times. 23% of the grave sites in the National Cemetery are World War II veterans. Almost 500 of them are war casualties, and that's where the most fascinating stories are. I'm going to share just one or two. If you would like a tour of the World War II grave sites, licensed battlefield guide Ralph Siegel has done a study of all 494 men and has statistics on them. He has even contacted the families of many of the veterans and has photographs of the men. So I'm going to share, with Ralph's permission, stories of some of the veterans who are buried at the National Cemetery. But if you want a personal tour, Ralph is available to do just the cemetery. It's always a jolt to my system to walk by a grave marker where the date of death is December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor Day. And yes, there are several in the cemetery with that infamous date. Here's just one sailor who died at Pearl Harbor, George Stembrowski. He was age 20. He was a seaman first class in the U.S. Navy. He was killed in action aboard his ship, the USS Nevada. The Nevada was the only battleship on December 7th that had a head of steam in its engines, and so the Nevada tried to get away. But while it was moving, it was hit hard when the second attack wave hit at about 9 a.m. It was in this second wave that most of those were killed who died in action. Now, Lewis Flanagan, I feel like I have a personal connection with. He was a combat medic, aged 30. He was from Clinton, Pennsylvania, and he had already been awarded the Bronze Star in fighting that happened near St. Lo, France, for rescuing a wounded man who had been hit by a sniper. Now, you should know that my mother's youngest brother, who was in the D-Day landings, was also killed by a sniper in St. Lo, France. So Flanagan's story hits close to home for me. His Bronze Star citation reads like this: Technician Flanagan went out into the field, cared for the wounded man, and removed him to a place of safety, even though several other men had been wounded attempting to remove that same soldier. But Flanagan himself was later killed in the Battle of the Bulge on Christmas Day. He now rests in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Here are two brothers buried side by side. I believe they are the only two brothers who rest side by side in this cemetery. Frank Materowitz, age 21, was from Etna, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Pittsburgh, and his brother Edward was only 19. Frank was a paratrooper in the elite 101st Airborne Division, and he parachuted into Normandy on June 6, 1944. He was killed only 6 days later. At first, he was buried at the American National Cemetery in Normandy before coming to Gettysburg. His younger brother Edward was in a plane shot down on December 29th, and he was killed. Originally, Edward was buried in Belgium. But after the war ended, many families requested the return of their loved ones. They asked that they be buried in the U.S. So in 1947 and 48, both of the brothers' bodies were brought home, one from the American cemetery in Normandy, one from Belgium, and they were buried here in Gettysburg, finally being side by side. And thank you, Ralph, for getting their pictures. Let's end our tour of World War II Gettysburg at the gravesite of Marine Corps Private Paul Heller. This young man from Allentown, Pennsylvania, was only 15 years old when he died. Heller served in the 1st Division of the Marine Corps, which in August 1942 had landed at a place that would become a household word, Guadalcanal. The Japanese forces had driven away the U.S. Navy, leaving the Marines stranded. Paul and his colleagues lived on rats and the rice captured from the Japanese engineers who had been there earlier building an airfield. Heller endured this nightmare for 2 months before being killed in action in heavy fighting. The U.S. would end up winning the island by February, and Guadalcanal has become legendary in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps. So, Mr. Heller is buried at the far end of the cemetery. You can see the fence line behind him, and behind that is another open section of cemetery that comes out on Steinmar Avenue. Very moving way to end a tour. I hope you've enjoyed this quick run through Gettysburg in World War II with our look at the people and the places that were part of an important time in our nation's history. Gettysburg, you can see, is more than a Civil War battlefield, and I hope you will remember some of these World War II stories. Once the tourism business opens up again after the pandemic allows us to travel, you can visit these sites that I showed you today. The Gettysburg Tour Company runs a Saturday afternoon World War II tour using tour guides that we have trained to cover these stories, and lets you visit the sites of the Navy's map-making service, at least where the buildings were, the Army's psychological warfare camp, the National Cemetery, and more. So I hope you will take advantage of the rich history here in Gettysburg, and thank you for allowing me to share these stories.